In 2009, I'd been a youth pastor for 7 years. I had a growing ministry, but a growing discontent in my own heart. What I didn't know at the time was that God was stirring my heart to plant a church. I'd been preaching the gospel or preaching Jesus for 7 years and saw a lot of young people come to faith. We had baptized many people, but I wasn't confident that I was actually making disciples. And in this growing discontent, I was discontent with the way we were doing church. And I felt like we needed to plant a new church. As this desire was growing in my heart, I ran across some things online by the Acts 29 network, and I bookmarked them, saved them for later. A buddy and I went to a retreat, and we came back convinced that I was called to plant a church. I talked to my wife about it, talked to my family about it, and they all affirmed the call to plant a church. I went into my boss at the time, the senior pastor of the church, and he seemed open to the idea. We didn't know when, we didn't know how. I figured we were a year away at least. Had no name, had no structure, had no people, didn't know what we were doing. And then a week later, I pulled into the church parking lot and I saw elders' cars in the parking lot on that Monday morning, and I knew my time was up. That day, I was fired. My wife at the time was 6 or 7 months pregnant with our second child, and I was thrown upside down. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know where I was going to get a paycheck the next month. I didn't know how I was going to support my family. I didn't know if my dream for a church plant was dead. The word started to get out that I'd been fired and that we were going to start a new church. It had only been maybe an hour, and a friend of mine called and said, "Here you're starting a church. I've got a building for you." And I was like, "Okay, this is weird." And he says, "You got to come look at it." I go, "All right, I'll come look at it." So we scheduled for the next day to come look at a building. It seemed like some of these pieces were falling into place, so we were like, okay, maybe this is really going to happen. Maybe God has called us to plant this church right now. And so we started kind of throwing together a vision, throwing together a mission, throwing together a plan to plant this church. We really didn't know what we were doing. I knew we wanted to be about Jesus. We wanted to be about helping the poor and serving the city, but I didn't really know what that was going to look like. And so what I did was went to that bookmark on my computer, filled out an application. I just rushed through it, hurriedly filled out this theological exam and this application for the Acts 29 network, and signed up for a boot camp. That in 4 weeks' time, I would be going to Louisville, Kentucky, sitting around 3 other church planters who had already planted their church, and they were seasoned pastors, and they were going to assess me on whether I was qualified to plant a church. I did that, and then I proceeded to do what I knew to do. I didn't really know what we were going to call our church. I knew I wanted city in the name, so I wrestled with Grace City or Passion City. I didn't really know what word I really wanted until we came to this building, the building that my friend said he had available, and we walked up and we saw Sacred Heart Cathedral. Immediately my mind went to sacred. I love that word. What if we called our church Sacred City Church? We gathered here at the Sacred Heart Catholic School 4 weeks in a row, and then I was scheduled to go to Louisville for my assessment with Acts 29. We were all nervous, but expectant. We were hopeful that things would go well, and this church had a hopeful future ahead of her. What we didn't know was everything was going to change on that weekend. My wife and I flew to Louisville. We sat under some great gospel preaching, and then it was time for our assessment.
Out of all of the memories that I have of Justin and Amanda, it's actually my first memory of them that stands out most in my mind. We were in Louisville, Kentucky at an Acts 29 assessment dinner. I went down as an assessor, was checking in, and they said, "Ethan, the assessors are supposed to have a yellow lanyard, but we're actually out of those, and so they gave me a red one, which was the color of all of the other assessees. I went to the assessment dinner, met Justin and Amanda, saw that they were from Davenport, introduced myself, and I was just asking Justin about some history and some context for their city and region. He was explaining the crazy season that he was in the midst of starting the church. I specifically asked him about the assessment process and the paperwork that you had to fill out to do well for this assessment. And he said, man, it's been such a crazy time that I made up a lot of the answers that I put down in my assessment. I shook my head and I said, well, that's interesting. As he was saying these things, the announcer was making some introductions and asked all the candidates to stand up, everyone with a red lanyard. And so Justin and Amanda stood up, and he looked at me with kind of some confused looks about why I didn't stand up. Then they asked all of the assessors to stand up. And I gave him a smirk, and then I stood up and I said, Justin, I'll be assessing you tomorrow. I really appreciate your honesty and your candor.
Acts 29 has a really thorough and rigorous assessment process. And so as part of getting ready for that, I had read about 80 pages of material that Justin and Amanda had submitted. And I remember you have to submit a sermon sample. And so Justin had sent a video of a sermon that he had preached, I think, as a youth pastor at another church, which was cool because most people submit audio. So it was kind of cool to have a video of I get to see not just how this guy preaches, but sort of how he interacts with a room. So I remember hitting play on that video, watching the first 8 or 9 minutes of that sermon and thinking, man, this guy can preach. He's a compelling communicator. He oozes vision and conviction. He comes alive in front of a room of people. And I just thought, this guy's either going to be a great force for the gospel or he's going to be a cult leader. There's no in between. He's either going to go in the line of classic good gospel theology or he's going to go off the rails. But either way, people are going to follow him. And so I remember telling him that in the assessment, saying, hey man, the good news is you're an amazing communicator. And the scary news is you're an amazing communicator. And so whatever message you're preaching, people are going to listen, people are going to respond to, people are going to follow. And so as we sort of evaluated where he was and just the broader context of how God was shaping and forming and developing him in preparation to plant a church, the outcome of our assessment was us looking across the table at Justin and Amanda and saying, we think the best thing for you is to press pause, move to another city and do a residency at an existing Acts 29 church for a year, and then move back to Davenport and plant your church. And I remember as we said that, just thinking, there's maybe a 50-50 chance here. That he embraces this and says, yeah, let's do that, or that he goes, man, Acts 29 is not for me, and that sounds like a long waiting period. And so to Justin's credit, about a week later, he called and said, hey, I'm in. We're willing to move wherever. We think the Lord is speaking here, and so where should we go?
We knew exactly what we had to do. We knew we had to close the church, submit to the leadership of Acts 29, humble ourselves, and go and get some training. This was not an easy decision for us. My phone was blowing up with, how'd the assessment go? Can't wait for you to be back. And I knew I was getting back and I was going to have to stand up in the pulpit and preach to this church and let them know, you've sacrificed a lot, you've left a church that you were comfortable in, and you've came to follow me, and yet I've got to leave, I've got to go, and we've got to stop Sacred City Church. And by that time we knew we were going to move to Omaha, get the training, get the healing, get the help that I need. And then if it's God's will, he would send us back to the Quad Cities to plant a gospel-centered church.
I remember the night that Justin gathered us all together after his assessment, and we were all expecting to move forward and all really excited about what the future held for the new church. And we were all very geared up and fired up and really excited. And so it was an absolute surprise when he told us that he pretty much, had decided that it would be best if he moved to Omaha. Initially, I was just so nervous and scared, and it was really hard. It was really hard. But those emotions were very raw. It took a long time to process. I remember a lot of people that came together and were like leaders or were going to be involved in the original church plant. A lot of us had to get together and just talk about it, and how we were all just stunned and jarred and just didn't know what the future was going to hold, and if there was ever going to be a church plant.
It's amazing to me how God knows exactly what we need when we need it, when we really have no idea. Amanda and I moved here to Omaha, and it was really one of the greatest things that's ever happened to us. Us as a couple, me personally as a man, of course as a pastor, as a father. One of the things I learned in Omaha, hanging out with Ethan, was I think clearly when I have a cigar in my hand. That's definitely a benefit. And but one of the interesting things that I learned right away is how the gospel is meant not to be preached, not just to be preached, but to be lived out, and how it's meant to get down in the depths of your soul and change you from the inside out. And that process is not very pretty. It's pretty ugly most of the time, and it was ugly for a while here in Omaha. One night, some men were pressing in on me, and I had been describing my life up until this moment, and it really centered around this idea that my identity was based on wrestling. And up until this point, everything in my life I basically saw as competition, and I had to wrestle it into submission, and it was me against whatever that was, and it was success or fail. It was up to me. It was really win or lose, live or die. I had to fight for my identity every day. And these men looked at me and they said, "Justin, what do you think it would look like to lay that identity down?" And I stopped and I said, "I have no idea." And it took like 10 minutes to even get that answer out of me, because I was just like, everything I know about myself is wrapped up in how aggressively I go after things and how I conquer things and how I kind of want to win and dominate things. I really don't know what that would feel like. And they said in the moment, like, "What do you think? Why don't you go to Jesus and ask him what would it be like to lay that identity down?" And I didn't have a dream or I didn't have a vision, but I just pictured it in my mind. I pictured myself walking up to Jesus as Jesus is on the cross and laying this identity down at his feet. And I said to him, when I laid this identity down, I said, "If I'm not the wrestler, then who am I?" And it was an honest question in the moment. It meant a lot to me in the moment, because I really couldn't see my life any other way. How I approached every problem, how I approached every situation in my life was to conquer and to win and to avoid weakness and avoid vulnerability and avoid looking like a fool. And I see Jesus there naked, hanging on a cross, the epitome of a fool. And I say, if I'm not the wrestler, then who am I? And I hear the words of the Spirit speak to me right away. And he says, "You're my loved and forgiven son." Now, I would like to say that meant a lot to me in the moment, but honestly it didn't. Immediately, I responded and said, yeah, I know that. I've been preaching that for 10 years. And just as quick, the Spirit responded and said to me, "When you're that, nothing else matters." And I lost it. I told my missional community this past week that I think I started crying there, and I don't think I stopped for another 6 months.
After this identity of the wrestler had been kind of named and surrendered, a lot of things started to change in Justin. And I guess if I were to summarize all of those changes, I would say the biggest one was that he started to let people in. And I guess up to this point, we'd been married for about 7 years, and I don't remember more than 2 or 3 times having people into our home. We had no close relationships, no close friendships. There were never any deep conversations that we were having. And that dramatically shifted after this identity had been sort of laid to rest. There was this new desire to be in community and to have people in our home. And the fear of having weakness or failure exposed and having people kind of see us in our messiness and in our real life, that was gradually fading away. And that was all part of that wrestler identity that had really ruled the way that we lived our lives previously. And so not only did he begin letting people in physically into our home, but also emotionally. Again, after being together for about 9 years, only a couple of times had I ever seen him cry or become emotional. And after this season of our lives, there was a lot of crying, frequent crying was happening. And it was like I could visibly see this concrete case that had been around his heart begin to crumble away. And I think that the way that he parented our kids changed as well. I think that he began to see time with them as actually being valuable and not just a hindrance to his productivity or his schedule or things that he wanted to accomplish. He actually enjoyed being with them and being with us as a family, and he was able to find rest in that.
On the very end. Top floor. 3rd floor, that was our apartment. So as God was changing my heart during my residency here in Omaha, the elders there had given me a lot of freedom in what to do. I met with them during staff meeting, I prayed with them, I lived in community and on mission with them, but then I had a lot of freedom. And one of the things that I did often was come to this coffee shop here, Scooters in Village Point. I would bring my books and my laptop and my iPad here, set up shop, and literally stay all day. I spent hundreds of hours here. I was spending a lot of time in the Word, a lot of time studying, and God began to put some big pieces together for me on what Sacred City was going to look like when we moved back home. I knew it was going to be gospel-centered, that everything was going to be centered on what God has done for us and not what we must do. I knew it was going to be reformed, again, that God is sovereign in salvation and He pursues us, we don't pursue Him. I knew it was going to be missional. I remember sitting in this coffee shop reading a book by Christopher Wright called The Mission of God and having my whole perspective on the Bible changed, that God is a missional God, He has a mission to be known, and therefore everything He's ever done throughout time and space is for that purpose. He wants people to come to know Him. And so our church isn't going to feel just like a family, it's going to feel like a family on mission. And I remember sitting here making phone calls to people back in the Quad Cities and saying, hey, would you support this work? Would you financially give to support this work? Are you interested in doing this? I'm planning on moving back to the Quad Cities, and it's not going to be like what I've done in the past. And honestly, I don't think it's going to be like any other church that we have in the Quad Cities right now. We're going to be gospel-centered. We're going to be missional. We're going to be liturgical on Sunday morning. All of these things, these core convictions of who we are, came out of hundreds of hours of study and prayer here at this coffee shop. And it shaped me profoundly, and it shaped our church. And surprisingly, our church today isn't much different than what I wrote down on paper, some vision documents we called a prospectus about 5 years ago. Our church is really not much different than what we planned on it to be, what we prayed it would happen, and what we wrote down on those papers.
Justin called me about 5 or 6 months or so into his residency in Omaha, and it was kind of to my surprise, really, when he initially tried to plant Sacred City for the first time. I just wanted to be a part and serve. I never really had the intention of being like the music guy or the worship guy. I just wanted to serve. So it was kind of a surprise when he called me, but it was a pleasant surprise. I was 20, 21 years old at the time. My life was okay, but I was searching for something, and when he called, he was talking about, well, he invited me to come live out there, to think about living out there with him, and the team that was kind of out there, and he was talking about Porterbrook, and he was talking about kind of learning what the gospel meant through that. He talked about redemption groups, kind of learning about the depths of the gospel and my own story and my own sin and my own need for a Savior. He talked about the community that he was being a part of there, and the fact that I would be kind of get to come under the wing of one of their worship leaders and kind of shadow him and learn what it meant to serve a gospel-centered missional church. So I kind of hung up the phone and was taken back a little bit, but I consulted my close friends and family, and the resounding answer was, you might as well do this. You really don't have anything to lose. And so I called him back, eventually moved out there. I lived in Omaha for 10 or 11 months, and it was really a gift from God. It was one of the most formative times of my life as a young man. Once again, I was kind of searching. I had an idea of what the gospel was, but I had no idea what it really meant for me. And I think everything that he talked about in that initial phone call kind of came to life and came true. I learned to love the gospel through learning about it in Porterbrook, and then when it was really my own sin was placed in my lap during redemption groups, I really found out that I needed Jesus, and then I got to learn how all of that played out in the context of living in a community and a family and serving the church. And I think that really laid a foundation early on for what was going to happen at Sacred City ministry-wise, and it laid a foundation that we needed and that I needed as a leader of the gospel just what it looked like to serve and live in a family of missionary servants and to lead that out.
Let's see it.
I do remember having a conversation with you when you told me you were going to start a church, and I do remember saying to you that I knew it was going to be successful. I was a kind of a broken person, but you didn't make me feel that way. And I think that the fact that you were a guy that was unwavering in your convictions, but at the same time, I knew I could sit down and have a beer with you and not feel like, is this weird that I'm drinking beer with a pastor? Yeah. But I was like, here's this just regular guy who I like to read the same books as him. Oh, he likes Tolkien, and he likes these violent Cormac McCarthy books. So this guy's cool. I think that's the way that it should be. We were talking about a Joel Osteen quote a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
And the quote was something about how, don't surround yourself with negative people, because then it's going to bring your life down. And I said to message you, I go, this couldn't be further from the truth. Even though on the outside I was this bubbly individual, I know that when we met I was a negative person. And from what I told you, you knew that whatever that means, that I was kind of dealing with a lot. And if you wouldn't have surrounded yourself with me or anybody else, where would I be now? And so it just dawned on me that day when you told me that when you were about to leave and you were going off, man, I knew it was going to be a great place, because every community needs good leadership, and missional communities are absolutely no different.
The first week of June 2011, we moved from Omaha back to Davenport, Iowa, and began our first missional community about 30 days later. I can remember that first day coming down with the moving truck and having about 20 people at my house ready to unload everything, fill up, set up the house. They were committed to living like family. We'd been talking for several months. I was coming down once month, and we were having a kind of a fake missional community gathering. We were talking about living life in community and on mission as family. What's that going to look like? And then the first Wednesday night of July, we launched our first missional community here in my living room. There's about 15 of us, I think, and we started working through the story of God. And it was brand new from so many people. People were coming from so many different backgrounds, unchurched backgrounds, very Pentecostal, charismatic backgrounds, Catholic backgrounds. We had no one who was really solid theologically. We had no one who was reformed. And so we began early on shaping people into disciples. And we began shaping people through the story of God and through gospel-centered life and through having community week in and week out and through eating together and praying together and pressing in on one another and applying the gospel to people's hearts. And this was brand new. It was exciting every week. You never knew what you were going to expect, what to expect in those early days of a missional community. And then we started fight clubs, and we started meeting outside of missional community for a small, more intimate discipleship. We were continuing to work through Porterbrook. We knew it was important to begin shaping us theologically, shaping us like in a gathered setting. But I was concerned that if people knew I was back and people knew there was a new, church in town, that people would probably leave some other churches and come. And I was really set and intent on being a missional church that made disciples of new believers. And so I didn't want to start a public gathering yet. And so we talked to some of the leaders and we decided, let's start a closed Sunday night gathering.
It was late summer of 2011, and I was looking for a place to go, and I emailed Justin and didn't get a response. And so I got the courage up to email him again and ask if I could come to his church plant. I had looked up Acts 29 online, and I told him who I was and that I was interested in coming, and he said no. And I was, upset, surprised, a lot of things. I was like, wow, what a pastor. And then waited and was trying to decide what else to do, and the church started up in January, and late January a friend came in and encouraged me to go. And so I went thinking, I don't want to run into that pastor. And I did, but I went, and the rest is history. I'm just thankful that God doesn't allow us to stay angry. I'm thankful God doesn't allow us to stay in a place alone.
In August of 2011, we moved into the building behind me and began hosting a closed Sunday night gathering. There was about 25 of us. We had 2 missional communities at the time. And it was important for us to begin gathering together because we wanted to be shaped as gospel-centered people inside the liturgy, inside the singing of song, and inside the preaching. We had very specific ways that we wanted to do that at Sacred City because we wanted to counter the attractional, consumeristic model that's so common here in the Quad Cities. We wanted to be liturgical. We wanted our worship music to be chosen based upon the richness of its heritage. We wanted old Christian hymns and also the quality of the theology behind the lyrics, not just on it if it's a catchy tune or not. And so we wanted to come down here and practice and get good at that. We had one 8x8 room for our kids. We had about 10 kids. We kind of threw them in there. We prayed for the best. We gave one leader the reins over that. And then we all had our gathering. And to be honest, we did not receive any positive feedback. Many people thought we felt like a funeral. My mother was convinced that we were now Catholic. It was a very difficult time for us because we were deprogramming people out of this consumeristic mode of worship that we had been so used to here in the Quad Cities. But we started preaching verse by verse through the book of Ephesians, and God started working in our young church. People started understanding the gospel in a new way. They started understanding the depth of their sin, that they were dead in their sins, but also what God has done for them through Christ, that they are now raised to new life. They started understanding words like election and predestination and what the gospel meant.
I remember kind of feeling like we were living on a wing and a prayer from some prayers that I had actually prayed in Omaha, that God would provide us with really servant-hearted people that were talented and gifted, and that could kind of help us do the work of the ministry when it came time to really do it. And so we started our Sunday night gatherings, and they were closed and they were small. And I remember thinking to myself, like, this is how it's going to be forever. Like, I remember thinking it's going to be me and Amanda and an acoustic guitar. For, if you would have asked me 5 years, what would we look like 5 years in the future, I probably had very small faith that it was going to be anything very big. But almost immediately, I remember God answering those prayers. I remember people like Sam coming, and Ben and Jarek, and people that they weren't just talented people. They were people that you want to do ministry with. They were really servant-hearted people that weren't vying for leadership. They just wanted to know how they could serve, and then on top of that, they were creative. And really, I think God was forming something really special in those early days, and even in those smaller gatherings. And I was really surprised and taken back by God's grace from the very beginning to provide what we needed.
So in January of 2012, this super secretive, closed church went public. We launched here with 68 people in the junior theater. For the first time, we had a children's ministry with 2 classrooms instead of just 1. And we picked right back up where we left off from our time down at the Connection. We had a liturgical service. We were singing hymns, and I was continuing to preach through the book of Ephesians. And we just so happened to find ourselves in the 5th chapter of the book of Ephesians. And so I did a 6-week series on marriage. And when people started hearing that we had launched, we didn't do anything publicly. We didn't have any type of advertisement. We only had a few signs that we would set out on Sunday morning. But when people started hearing we were no longer a closed church, they started showing up. And that 6-week series in Ephesians on marriage, we shot up to 150 people. And we were kind of overwhelmed and blown away. And we still had 3 missional communities. And I think we were pushing to launch our 4th missional community. But that overnight success, which is kind of what it felt like, did not last for long. And pretty soon people started to realize we were really serious about making disciples, living in community, and living on mission, and we weren't going to be just a Sunday morning gathering. And so by that summer, our numbers dwindled right back down to around 62 people on a Sunday morning. And I remember thinking, are we going to make it? Is this really going to happen? Are we going to be a healthy church? Are we going to be is this sustainable for us? We had some people leave the church at the time, some leaders that were leading missional communities moved away from the area. And it was a really difficult season, really dark season. We were wondering if we were going to make it. And then I remember distinctly in Omaha, receiving some counsel from Bob. At this time, we were still under the oversight of an external advisory board. And I remember them counseling me and them speaking to me and telling me, Justin, you need to be on mission not only to the lost, but you need to be on mission to those who are in churches who are not healthy. They're in churches, they're attending churches, but they're not being discipled. And the goal isn't to just, to have somebody a member of a church, but to have somebody being discipled as a part of that church. And a significant mindset changed for me during that conversation. And I remember no longer kind of being antagonistic towards the church folks that were joining our church, but then trying to get our church, those that were joining us on Sunday, the few that would come to check us out on Sunday, into missional communities, and those in missional community to come and circle back around and join us on mission in our Sunday morning gatherings as well. And we just made commitment. We're going to be faithful. We're going to continually doing what God's called us to do. So at this time, we began to have Bible studies down at 11th Street Precinct. We began to host missional music nights down at the 11th Street Precinct. We were trying to get some of our people that were joining us to be on mission to us in the city.
So my connection to Sacred City is through meeting Justin at a CrossFit gym. I was joining the gym, and he came in actually the first day that I came to work out there. I was talking to the owner, and he said that a pastor was coming in. So I was pretty excited about that, because at that time was when I was first opening up my chiropractic office. And my really purpose for being at the gym was not to just work out. It was actually for marketing purposes. I was there to kind of meet people and hopefully get them into my chiropractic office. And so when I heard pastor, I was like, wait, I don't just have to meet these people at the gym. Maybe I can meet some of these people at this pastor's church. So I developed a relationship with him, and I thought my idea was actually working, because very soon after that, him and Amanda started as patients in my office. And then just throughout that relationship, Justin started to ask me questions about the church I was going through too, and how that was going. Then he ended up giving me a book called Knowing God. And after just a few weeks of probably reading that, he asked me did I want to meet to start talking about that book. And that's really how we started. Actually, what's now is our Fight Club. We started meeting every Tuesday morning, and I was just kind of give him some questions, he would give me answers. We started building that relationship. From there, actually for a few weeks, we were doing that, and then they were starting a new missional community. So he asked me, did I want to start coming to the missional community? We did that. At the time where I was going through missional community, we were still actually attending our previous church. So it wasn't probably for a few months where we started to come on Sundays and actually start being part of Sacred City. So it's kind of funny when I look back, is my whole purpose really for the beginning of a relationship was to meet Justin. Obviously love to work out with him, but kind of get him into my office. And I found out that the whole time, he was on mission to me, having the desire to disciple me, bring me into the church so I can be part of this Sacred City community.
So for the first few years of our church, we didn't have any office space, we didn't have anywhere to meet, so when we were doing Bible studies, we came down here to 11th Street. Our band was also playing kind of as the house band down here, and we'd invited a bunch of our friends and family who were not believers, and they'd come down here and we'd celebrate, and we'd have a party, and our band would play, and it was a great missional opportunity for us to be on mission to those outside the church and welcoming into a third space. I can still remember the night we did a Bible 101 class here, and 3 folks came in for a smoke break, and one of them was drunk, and they sat down and stayed and listened to our entire talk on the Bible, and then even asked questions afterward. It was a really fun time for us to learn how to take our faith and make it practical for the everyday life. So not just Christian on Sunday, not just Christian inside of a church, not just Christian inside your home, but how are you Christian in a bar? It was a great time for us. And we also celebrate, one of our rhythms is celebration. So every time a missional community was birthed and multiplied, we would throw a party. We still do that. We still throw parties. We used to only have a party here. And so I think we had the first 6 multiplication parties right here. Every single night or every Saturday night, we'd get together when we'd multiply, and then we'd throw a party, and we just have a great celebration here. So this was an important part of us launching Sacred City. We had a great relationship here with 11th Street. The work that God has done in and through Sacred City over the past 5 years has been nothing short of spectacular. It did not come immediately. There was nothing really impressive that we've done. We wanted to center on the gospel, live that out in community, and be on mission. That's what we've wanted to do from day one. And our mission and our vision has not changed. For the last 4.5 years that we've been public, we have seen leaders trained and raised up. We've seen new missional communities launched. We've seen marriages and births. And it has all been done in the nitty-gritty messiness of everyday life. And God has been gracious to do that. Week over week, sometimes you can't even notice that we're growing. It's only here sitting in my office now, 5 years later, looking back, that we say, wow, look what the Lord has done through God's people living on mission. This isn't a testimony to my greatness. This isn't a testimony to any man's greatness. This is a testimony to how the Spirit of God, through the power of the gospel, works through everyday people living their lives with gospel intentionality here in the Quad Cities. These past 5 years, we have multiplied to 11 missional communities currently, in all 4 of our Quad Cities. We have baptized over 80 people here at Sacred City Church in the last 5 years. We've dedicated 19 babies to the Lord. We have had 22 couples get married here at Sacred City. We have given over $43,000 to further the gospel through church planting. We have sponsored over 50 children in Kenya. We have planted 17 missional communities in Kenya. We have grown from when we first launched our Sunday gathering to about 60 folks on a Sunday. Our average attendance this month is 248 people. We have 137 covenant members with us. If you include their children, we have 226 members. We have 2 elders right now. We have 3 men who are currently in elder development in the process of becoming elders. We have 61 missional community leaders in our city right now. We have 23 deacons, and we have 5 men who are currently on staff. God has multiplied us. He has increased our influence, and we are incredibly grateful and thankful to God. This past winter, we renovated this building that I'm sitting in now, a 100-year-old building, and we renovated it for our first ever permanent kids space and offices, and we have been just thrilled with the results and how God is continuing to use it and bless our body and bless our city. Our 11 missional communities are serving different nonprofits all throughout our city. They've been doing it from day one. Whether it's the homeless, whether it's troubled teens, whether it's those who are incarcerated, our people are living on mission here in the Quad Cities, and they're renewing our city. And the renewal that we got to take place in this building here on the Junior Theater campus is just a small picture of how we're at work and our people are at work renewing our city through the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we're thrilled for what God has accomplished through us in this short 5 years. We don't want to be just a new church. We want to be a church who plants churches, who plants churches. Since the very beginning of Sacred City, we've been about the gospel, community, and mission. We feel like our calling is to make disciples, plant churches if God would be gracious enough to us, and renew the city. By God's grace, we are planning to plant our first church in Moline, Illinois in January of 2017. We have been training Samuel Schmidt for the past 3 years. We have assessed him, we have trained him, we have equipped him, and now we feel called to send him to Moline with 50 or so of some of our best people to plant a new sacred city on this side of the river. It has been great to see what God has done for us and in us on the Iowa side, specifically in Davenport and spreading out into Bettendorf. And we've got 2 missional communities over here on this side, and a third expecting to be launching before the first of the year. And we want to see what is God going to do on the Illinois side of the river. We don't want to be a huge church and have a huge gathering, but we do want to have a huge influence in our city. And so for us, that means planting more churches and keeping our congregations smaller so they feel like a large, like extended family on Sunday, where all the missional communities are coming together to celebrate the goodness of the Lord. The story of Sacred City Church is really a story about the grace of God. God has been so gracious to us over these past 5 years. We are so thankful to Him for what He's done in us and through us here at Sacred City Church, and we're really hopeful. We're hopeful for the grace of God, the future grace that's on its way, as we plant churches, as God brings more people to Sacred City, as we multiply missional communities and more elders are trained up and sent out to plant new churches. We are so thankful for what God's done in our past, and we're so hopeful for what God's going to do in their future. And we want you, as a member of Sacred City, to be on mission with us here in our cities, because this is not the end, it's just the beginning.